This story happened at the end of the summer of 2016. To give you a bit of backstory, my boyfriend and I were both around 20. My boyfriend Max and I used to share an apartment with another married couple. Mind you, they were awesome. Unfortunately, Florida wasn't what they wanted, so they decided to move to Pennsylvania. Max and I started looking for people to replace them because rent where we lived was pricey, and we didn't want to have to pay for the whole thing on our own. It was in a very nice area, but not close enough to the cities, so most people that told us they would drop by to check the place out would flake out last minute. Eventually, we found this person that seemed to be a very nice and laid-back girl. She then explained how she was only looking for a place for her boyfriend, Dan. Now, I tend to see people's auras when I meet them, and I always get a certain feeling when I don't like them immediately. I'm not a judgmental person in the slightest. It's just something I feel and can't help. I did not like this person straight off the bat, but I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt because everyone else seemed to be okay with him, so I thought I might be wrong, and I was hoping I was. As the time went by, said Dan started being super loud, invited people over on weeknights till 4 a.m., playing music loud enough for it to sound like it was being played from our room, etc. Annoying stuff like that, too, and being beyond disrespectful, especially to me. Max wouldn't do anything about it, and I'm kinda glad because I know Dan would have wanted to fight him or something. Dan was 22 at the time, but had the mentality of a 12-year-old. Now, on a side note, we later found out that Dan had previous mugshots for shoplifting and other stuff. He also threatened to get me beat up several times. I just wanted to give you a bit of insight on Dan so you understand what is coming. Buckle up. It was a Wednesday night. I got home at 5:30, and as I was walking upstairs and almost to the 3rd floor, which is where we lived, I saw him coming out of the apartment, but I don't say anything because I don't like him, so I mostly ignored him. But he started yelling at me and telling me to look at the apartment. I looked inside from the doorway and I saw nothing wrong, so I asked what he was talking about, and in an angry voice, he claimed that we had been robbed and that he had also just gotten home to this. But I saw all furniture in there and whatnot, so I'm thinking he was on one of his drugs. He usually was. I came in and did notice that my Wii U is gone, but the rest of my consoles were there. GameCube, PS3, Xbox, etc. So at this point, I was already suspicious of him. I tried to keep calm as much as I could and call Max to see how far from home he is. We usually both get home around the same time. As I'm calling, Dan yelled at me again that he had called the cops, and they were on their way, and in these exact words he says, "Do whatever you need to do because the police are on their way." When he told me that, I immediately knew he had been home for a while because he must have had time to hide all of his weapons and paraphernalia and God knows what else he had. Within 5 minutes, the cops were pulling in, and so was Max. One officer went upstairs with Dan and Max to write down everything that was missing, and the other stayed downstairs. I stayed with him just chatting. According to Max, we were missing a lot in our room, but Dan is only missing his PS4. I did ask him at last if it was possible to search Dan's car, and I also said if he needed to search my or Max's car, we'd be okay with it. He said it wasn't necessary, but agreed to search Dan's car. The officer didn't seem to like Dan very much right off the bat either. Once they all came back downstairs, officers asked Dan if they could search his car, and that they also needed his ID. He said he was okay with them searching his car, but he had to go get his ID and keys from the apartment. Max and I followed him upstairs. We saw him get his wallet and keys, and he left the apartment. We don't want to be nosy and stay downstairs while they search his car, so we stayed in the apartment. A few minutes go by, and he's still not downstairs with the cops, so we start looking around the neighborhood, but he had already vanished. How convenient. But since he had agreed that they could search his car and in no moment said they couldn't, they went ahead and started looking in the car if it was unlocked, and it was. We found all of our stuff in his car. One of our 2 3DSs that were missing, our PS4 controller. We had no PS4, but we used to play PC games. Max's laptop, some Wii U games, etc. The next morning, I put all of his stuff out by the dumpster and had a locksmith change our locks. I thought of putting a restraining order on him, but ended up never going through with it. A few weeks later, we saw his car parked outside a few yards from our building, but we pretended like we didn't see him and we just watched him from our room with 911 ready to be dialed. Thankfully, eventually he just left. My wonderful mother is a travel agent, and when I graduated college, she was able to use points that she earns from work to get us tickets to Italy. We aren't a wealthy family, so we travel as lightly and cheaply as possible. This means Airbnb and sketchy hotels with cheap rates. We flew into Venice and spent a few days up there and then took a train and a boat over to Sicily, where my mom's father is from. We were there in early October, so it was the off-season, and we found a cheap hotel, and they weren't busy at all, so my mom was able to get one of the hotel staff to come to the boat dock and pick us up and take us back to the hotel. It was about a 20-minute drive up through the mountains to where we were staying. The hotel was basically little villas, so every guest had their own building that was separate from the others. I use the term villa incredibly loosely. They were one-story, one-bedroom buildings with bedsheets and blankets bought from a thrift store. Nothing matched. The reception building is the only building that could get internet, and it was where the dining service was. Our only option was to eat there because 1, we didn't rent a car, and 2, the city closest to where we were staying in was down a mountain, so it was impossible to walk up and down. So at dinner on the first night, 3 of the men who worked at the hotel were hanging around me and wouldn't leave me alone. They kept pouring my mom and I wine, and one was trying to serenade me. He got so close to me that I felt like he was trying to kiss my neck. I pushed him away and kept my distance from them the rest of dinner. The following night, my mom takes her iPad down to the reception area to browse Facebook, and I stay up in the room reading my Kindle. I didn't pay to have service on my phone. If I wanted to use the internet, it would be about 40 cents a minute. I'm an hour into watching an Italian soap opera on the world's smallest TV, think Michael Scott's plasma screen, and I decided to join my mom in the reception area to use their internet. I go to leave the villa and the door is locked from the outside. I did not understand why the doors function like that, but I was locked inside and they could not be unlocked from the inside. I hurried up and turned my internet on, and Facebook messaged my mom that I was locked in the room and that she should come up and unlock it for me. I waited for it to show it sent, and then I turned my internet back off. After a few minutes, I decided, forget it, and I kicked out the screen window in the bedroom and climbed out that way. I started my trek down part of the mountain to the reception area, maybe a 10-minute walk. As I'm walking down the path, I can see a small pair of headlights parked in front of our villa. I'm hidden behind some trees so I could see the lights, but they would not have been able to see me. I shrug it off and continue walking. I get down to the reception area and my mom looks shocked to see me. "I just sent Puerto." The chef, who speaks no English, one of the guys who was hanging around me, "up to get you." "Oh well, he'll figure it out when I'm not there." I sit down to enjoy the internet while I have it, but I wasn't able to get my phone to connect to the internet. As bummed as I was, I let it slide and just read some more on my Kindle with my mom still browsing Facebook. The men stayed creepy with me, but I stayed pretty aware and away from them. My mom is really sweet and very trusting, so she didn't notice how they were acting towards me. A few days later, we were ready to fly back to the US. Right as the plane landed and I was able to turn airplane mode off, my phone flooded with Facebook messages from 2 of the men that I met that worked at the hotel. I had to Google Translate all of them from Italian to English. The messages from the first guy, the one who picked us up from the docks originally, were harmless. "I think you are very cute," messages like that. The messages from the second guy, the 35-year-old chef who my mom asked to pick me up in his Vespa after she accidentally locked me in our room, were worse. First message, obviously from when he first came up to the mountain to get me. "Are you in your room? Where are you? I want to kiss you." Second message, "Are you in the bathroom? I'm going to wait right outside the door for you." Third message, "Where are you, sexy? Are you even here? I'm going to kiss you when I see you." So I blocked them. My mom had friended them, and they would comment on photos of me on her profile and write really disgusting things, so my mom had eventually blocked them too. Not sure what would have happened if I didn't decide to leave out the window right when I did. This happened in the summer when I was 12 and was getting ready to enter 7th grade. My mom had just dropped me off at my dad's, and I went to my room to start getting ready for the vacation we were going to go on the next day. A while later, around 10 p.m. I believe, I was sitting up in my bed listening to music through headphones when I heard a loud pop noise. It startled me, and I paused my music. Now, to give some perspective, my bed was in the corner of my room, and across the room in the center was my window. This is important for later. And from directly across me was my TV. There was a desk under my window, and I thought that something might have fallen off of that. I got up and walked across the room to investigate, but nothing seemed to be out of place. I went to my door, and when I opened it, my dad was coming down the hallway and asked me if I heard the noise. I said yes and told him that I already checked to see if anything in my room fell. We checked around the kitchen and living room, and everything seemed normal. By this point, my stepmom joined us, and we turned on my lights to double-check, since it seemed the source was in my room. I had the idea to check the window and lifted my blinds. I found a small hole in the window that wasn't there before. There was also a small chunk missing from one of my blind strips. I called my dad over, and he said it looks like a bullet hole. My stepmom said the same, and we called the cops. I was shaken from this and waited in the living room until the cops got there. I went in with them and explained what had happened. They searched the room and then went outside to search. They came back in and told us that the fence in front of my window had the same hole. One of the cops went to the neighbor's house. Turns out, it was my neighbor who shot through the window. We lived next to an elderly couple, and apparently the man was suffering from either Alzheimer's or dementia. I can't remember which. He told the cops that we had been partying, which we weren't. We were all in bed, and that we were too loud, so he decided to grab his gun and teach us a lesson. He shot through his side of the fence where my window happened to be. My dad decided not to press charges because the man was suffering with mental illness, and instead the man went to a home, which I believe was already the plan before this happened, but it's been almost 8 years since this, so my memory on certain details are patchy. Eventually the cops left after everything was settled, and I slept on the couch that night. We still went on vacation the next day, and honestly that was okay with me because I did not want to be in that room. 2 things that are the scariest to me out of all of it. 1, to my knowledge, the bullet has never been found. The cops couldn't find it, and neither could I or my parents. Who knows where it shot through, and we know about where it hit in my room. Across from the window, I had a framed poster of Van Halen, an 80s rock group for those unaware, and the bullet hit the frame right where the drummer's crotch was. This was the only funny part about this, and it still makes me laugh, to be honest. 2, the cops said I had a chance of dying that night. They said it would have been very likely that if I had been standing up or if my bed were to be in the center, the bullet could have gone through my skull. Thank you, Dad, for putting my bed in the corner. To sum this up, I'm not going to say, "Shooter, let's not meet again," or anything like that, because I'm pretty sure he has passed in the last couple of years. So 1, the statement wouldn't make sense, and 2, I feel it'd be really disrespectful. But to be clear, I have no hate for the man. Yes, his reasoning and fact that he did that was terrifying, but he was old and not in his right mind. I wasn't hurt and have never been upset with him or any of his family. I wished him the best and to get help. Out of all of this, I'm just really glad that my bed was in the corner and that I didn't need to get up when he shot through my window. This event occurred only around 5 months ago and still gives me minor anxiety to this day. For context, I'm a male and am currently a high school senior. This had all happened on a normal weekend just like any other one. I was hanging with 2 close buddies of mine, which I will refer to as Joey and Kev. Now, Joey and I are your stereotypical stoners, and During this time especially, it almost seemed like a contest to see which of us could get more messed up. This particular weekend, however, he had me beat since he bought a tab of acid and took it early that afternoon. Kev had eventually met us at Joey's house not long after, since we both got a kick out of watching Joey trip over everything. Eventually, a couple of hours into our partying, and Kev and I were sufficiently baked. We wanted to drive to the Dollar Tree nearby to get some cheap Arizona teas for the Cottonmouth. It was around 8:30 and we wanted to make it before close. Joey obviously didn't want to stay at the house by himself, so he came with. Now, Kev is an athlete and doesn't smoke a lot, and ended up getting really baked, and Joey didn't want to be left alone in the car, so I volunteered to go in by myself, which was a really bad decision. When entering the store, all seemed fine until I made my way to the back where the refrigerators were and instantly felt like I'm being watched. At the time, being a little stoned, I had just blamed it on my anxiety, until I turned around and nearly jumped out of my skin to see a creepy man staring directly at me. He was hiding partially behind the end of the aisle, only extending his leg out to peer at me from around the corner. He was a scrawny dude and was wearing dirty clothes and a black beanie. I had kept eye contact with him for what seemed like hours. I'm a fairly big dude, and though I'm only 6 foot, I do have a large frame, which usually helps me in these situations. So, with the deepest voice I could make out, I spouted something along the lines of, "What do I look, famous or something?" He stood up and began walking in the center of the aisle and started calling me Derek. I don't remember everything, but I do recall him telling me casually, "Don't act like a stranger." "And why are you ignoring me, man?" I also noticed he was holding one of those green Sprite bottles in his hand. It was clear from his slurred speech and pronunciations that he had to be messed up on something. At first I thought he was drunk, but his eyes just looked crazy. I tried to tell him that he had the wrong dude, and I promised him that we didn't know each other, but it only angered him more and more. It didn't take long before he was screaming at me. I didn't know what to do other than trying to walk away from him, but he continued to follow me around the store. He started threatening me and describing how he was going to saw off my fat fingers and make me eat them. My last attempt to get this guy to buzz off was to walk to the cashier, but he continued to act like a crazy person. At this point, everybody in the store, which was only several others, started to look towards the commotion. I tried to explain the situation to the cashier over his yelling, but she looked just as terrified as I was. It took every ounce of bravery to try to ignore this dude, and I tried to turn my back to him. Out of nowhere, he broke the Sprite bottle over my right shoulder, and he started trying to wrap his hands around my throat and choke me. The guy even left a cut on the side of my neck with his fingernails. The adrenaline rushed into me, and my only reaction was to break his grip on my neck and shove him to the ground. My mind was racing with anxiety as I stood over him, angry, trying to be tough. Afterwards, he just got up and ran out of the store. I stupidly told the cashier not to call the police since I figured he had just booked it. She was really nice and respected this since I also looked really out of it and was obviously underage. She was even kind enough to break the rules and let me keep the drinks for free as well as some Band-Aids. I had felt relieved for the moment until I walked out of the store and glanced to my right to see him standing against the wall, out of sight of the store's window with a large pocket knife in his hand. I froze for a second until he started to sprint towards me. I halted for my car, lunged for the car door, which to this day I'm happy was unlocked, and threw the car into reverse. I peeled out, trying to wrap my brain around what had just happened. Joey and Kev were freaking out at this point and asking me a million questions. The stress and fear of everything finally seemed to affect me and brought me to tears at a stoplight on the way back to Joey's. I constantly look back and wonder if I could have done things differently if I was sober. It feels good to be able to get it off my chest since I've only told my friends about the encounter. Overall, my life isn't all that exciting, but this is by far one of the scariest things to ever happen to me. This happened to me almost a decade ago as a sophomore in a college in Manhattan. I am a female who grew up in New York, just a bit outside of Manhattan. Though it wasn't until after my first year or two of college that I learned to be a typical New Yorker and stop engaging with strangers on the street. Though I did have at least one super cool experience with a stranger that I spent like 3 hours with and never saw again. But looking back on, I'm like, what on earth, or how did you not get murdered? Sorry, very long-winded way to say that I was a pretty friendly girl who, especially when I first moved to the city, would happily respond to a stranger on the street. More often than not, it proved to be a bad idea. This particular time, though, I will never forget. It was scary, but even more so strange. So I had just moved to a spot next to St. Mark's. I am pumped to decorate my place and decided I wanted to go to the flea market on Broadway to look for cool artwork. It's a short walk, made longer by my wandering. As I wander in the direction I need to go, I end up walking next to a man who's probably a good 2 decades older than me. He's tall, tan, and otherwise nondescript. I don't know how the interaction started. I'm assuming it was with eye contact and a smile. First mistake. Then I willingly entered into a conversation with him. Why, I don't know. He spoke English and Spanish, and for some reason I decided that I wanted to speak to him in Spanish, though I am not fluent, but know enough to carry a conversation. And as a dumb 19-year-old, must have thought I was fancy or something. I'm pretty sure the conversation was pretty innocent. I mean, I didn't know enough to let it get weird or anything. I think he eventually asks if he can come with me wherever I'm going, and I laugh, because I'm a 19-year-old female and have no idea how to navigate a situation like this, / don't see how he could be serious. Eventually, I thought to tell him that he couldn't because I needed to be quick because company was coming. Actually true too, even though I should have just said no. And then put my headphones in and walked ahead. It seemed fine for maybe a minute. Then I feel my eyes burning into the side of my head. Ugh, what have I done? He wants to talk. I don't want to talk. I keep my headphones in, smile, and walk faster. Nope. He's still slightly behind me and walking briskly to keep up. I cross the street. He crosses the street. The flea market is in view. I think to myself stupidly that he's not going to follow, and if he does, it'll be easy to lose him in all of the little booths. Finally, I'm at the flea market and I duck right on inside. I don't see him follow, breathe a sigh of relief, and decide I can take a minute to browse. I even managed to pick up some cool skyline / typical New York pictures. As I'm wandering through each booth, I see him being buddies with one of the booth owners. He points to me. What? Well, so much for that sigh of relief. I've seen too many crime shows and decide that the best way to lose this guy is to zigzag around the flea market. Looking back, it's like, really? It's an outdoor flea market the size of a 2-bedroom apartment. You're not fooling anyone. I also decide to call my friend. We'll call her Jen. I tell Jen that I need her to stay on the phone with me because some weirdo is following me, and if something happens, I need a witness. She's a bit worried. I explain the interactions and how I'm currently working to dodge my way through the flea market to get home. She's half laughing at, half scolding me, and navigate my way out of the flea market undetected, or so I think, and start heading towards home. I don't see him or feel his stare. I start to think I'm in the clear. I tell Jen that I'm keeping her on the phone until I get home, and she agrees it's the best course of action. So I've been out of the flea market and walking down Broadway for about 3 minutes, and now Jen and I are engaging in normal conversation about life, when all of a sudden something or someone grabs my right ankle. I scream. I hear Jen yelling my name, asking what's happening. I turn around horrified to see the man from earlier with a huge grin. He's crouched down on the ground. On his way up, he gleefully exclaims, "I'm a chihuahua." What? Jen is still in my ear yelling at me to let her know that I'm okay, and I'm standing in the middle of the sidewalk trying to process what on earth would possess a grown man to grab a strange woman's ankle and yell, "I'm a chihuahua." I honestly can't remember how I reacted. I'm pretty sure I just shook my head and ran away. Literally ran away down busy Broadway. You better believe there were multiple other people on the sidewalk too. Not one bat an eye. Like I said, this happened nearly a decade ago. Unfortunately, I have not met that chihuahua again. This was back in October 2018 when I had accompanied my mom to a clinic in a small town about an hour away from Frankfurt. I'm in my late 20s and female. We were there for about 2 weeks while my mom underwent treatment for cancer. Unfortunately, soon after arriving, she experienced a lot of pain in her leg, and we later found out that the cancer had spread there, and her leg could break at any wrong step. This meant that if I was going to see anything, I had to go alone. This was fine, as the town we were in was extremely small and filled mostly with the old and sick. There was a larger town only about a mile away up and over a fairly steep hill, and a large park in between. It was about noon and my mom wasn't going to need to be around, so I decided to go for a walk around the park. To get there, I just had to walk down the path, cross a street lined with inns and cafes on the side leading to the park. There are twisting paths crisscrossing over each other, a lot of benches, a couple of fountains, and 1 or 2 community buildings. I choose a path that would take me right beside an underground fountain about as deep as my shoulders, I'm 5'7", with steps leading down to the spout. It was there that I first saw him. I was heading almost directly toward the fountain when a man's head pops up, looks directly at me. I look back at him for a second, thinking I had surprised him just as much, and we do the normal look away quickly thing. I was the only one who looked away. When I looked back, I realized he was still watching me, and then I noticed that he had one arm crossed over his chest and moving, as though he was touching himself. As soon as I realized this, I looked away and changed my direction to give him a wide berth. I was so stunned and in disbelief that I convinced myself that whatever he was doing had nothing to do with me, and that as long as I kept walking, he'd go back to being weird all by himself. I turned down a path that, for the immediate area, was wide open. I was still close to the cafe and inns and the occasional other person also taking a midday walk. I was almost to an area that would take the path through patches of woods, which would also take me out of the public eye, when I looked back to see if the guy was still in the fountain, but he was gone. Surprised, I quickly did a circle and noticed he had taken off, doing a wide loop that left a lot of opportunity for us to cross paths again if I didn't change directions. Once again, I couldn't believe it. I thought, it's the middle of the day, we're in a quiet but not unpopulated town about a mile away from a larger one. There's no one here but old and sick people. There's no way a predator would be here now, hunting me. But I still stopped and decided to change directions again. This time, my idiot self decided to take a tiny path that would lead me to the base of the hill that would go over to the larger town and was heavily wooded. I get up to where the trees started and decided to look again. That's when I noticed that he had also changed his direction and was practically jogging away from me. I looked back up the path and realized that continuing would leave me completely alone and vulnerable, and even though I didn't know where it led, I had a fairly good idea that the path the guy was jogging up would eventually connect to this path in the woods because they all did. So I stood at the end of the path and waited until the guy was out of sight before I turned around and headed in the opposite direction, through the grass of a pretty wide open portion of the park. I got to where I was a safe distance away and pulled out my phone to start recording myself. I figured it would just look like I was video chatting with someone. This was when I was shown without a doubt that this guy was after me, because not long after I made it across the park, but to where I could still see the path up the hill, he comes down the very same path, looking side to side, looking for me. He eventually spots me again. I had very bright dyed red hair and was pretty easy to spot in such wide open area. It's at this point I feel safe enough because there are people nearby, and I'm within running distance of the town should this guy book it towards me, that I keep wandering around testing to see how far this guy will go. He keeps following me, trying to stay out of sight, because at one point I turn around suddenly to watch him sprint back into some trees, until eventually I go up a hill that has zero cover for him to use and I lose track of him. I continued on to explore a different small town, making sure I'm always in a public space and easily seen, but I never saw him again. Trust your gut. My head was telling me that there was no way this could be happening to me, and I almost tested it by walking up into the woods, but my gut screamed bad idea, and I couldn't be more relieved that I listened. Trust your gut. the story is a little bit different. In this particular story, I was on the other end. I was the creeper. I'll start with a little background on me so you can understand the type of person I am. I didn't have a traumatic childhood. I was never abused, neglected, or any of the stereotypical serial killer stuff. In fact, it was quite the opposite. If anything, my family maybe gave me too much and was overly protective. I think this is actually what led to my issues. I was never allowed to go to other kids' houses unless my mother had met their parents first, which led me being left out of things a lot. I was also not allowed to watch a lot of movies that other kids my age were always talking about. For example, Jurassic Park was huge with my classmates when I was around 10, but I never got to watch it. I believe I was 16 or 17 by the time I actually saw the movie for the first time. This kind of thing led me to being further out of the loop. Couple that with the fact that my grandma would buy me pretty much anything I even hinted that I wanted, which led to a lot of jealousy from other kids, and I was more or less the bullied loner all through school. I never really learned how to relate to other people, and I'm socially awkward and have anxiety issues to this day anytime I have to deal with anyone I don't know well. As far as looks goes, I know people tend to expect creepers to be overweight, balding guys with thick glasses and bad skin. You know, the typical 40-year-old basement dweller. I'm sorry to disappoint, but I've always been told I'm a decently attractive guy. I'm at worst average looking. Even in high school, when I was an outcast, I overheard a girl talking about me once and saying something along the lines of, "Yeah, he'd be hot if he wasn't so freaking weird." So you really can't judge a book by its cover. Relationships have always been a huge struggle for me for two main reasons. One, I struggle to even approach someone I don't know, let alone hold a conversation, figure out if they're interested and ask them out. Most of the girlfriends I've had usually pursued me and initiated the relationship. The second reason is that being around other people is utterly draining for me. It takes an extreme effort for me to try to appear normal around others. I'm constantly worried about whether I'm doing or saying the right things. I go through conversations in my head before I actually speak to make sure it won't be misunderstood. I second-guess everything and sit there and analyze every tiny detail of their reactions to me to see if I'm coming off as I mean to. The effort is utterly exhausting, and most of the time I'd rather just be alone. However, I am still a human being, and I still have a need for attention and affection. The problem is, I'm like a dog chasing a car. I don't know what to do with it when I finally get it, and it usually ends in pain. Anyway, on to the actual story here, since I know you're not all reading this just to read about my depressing life history. I was in my early 20s, just after college. The local rock radio station I listened to got a female DJ who was on during the time I was usually listening to the radio. She seemed cool, played a lot of stuff I liked, and was fun to listen to, so I would tune in pretty much every night. She would occasionally talk a little bit about her personal interests, and I shared most of them. She liked video games, comic books, rock music obviously, and other somewhat nerdy, especially for a girl, things. I was eventually convinced that we had so much in common that she was the perfect girl for me. I followed her on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, pretty much every social media page she had, even tracking down her personal Facebook and not just the public one she advertised on the radio. I talked to her through social media whenever I could think of something to say, which most of the time just ended up being song requests, but she was always friendly and even gave me a shout-out on air one night. I know I'm already sounding creepy, but I swear my intentions were 100% innocent at this point. I really just liked this girl a lot and wanted to get to know her, but had no idea how to go about it. I started going to every concert the radio station sponsored, which in our small town were not very big or very often. We don't have any kind of arena or anything, so they were all at bars with a few hundred people at most. We got some nationally known bands, but nobody major. They were mostly up-and-coming bands or bands who were past their prime. The biggest thing they had was in a field behind a bar with a couple thousand in attendance. Anyway, she was always there, of course, since she worked for the station, and because the concerts were so small, I would always see her. I could never work up the guts to go talk to her because at this point, I had put her on this pedestal in my mind and just couldn't talk to her unless I was sure I would say the right things. I couldn't have her first impressions of me being anything less than perfect, so most of the time, I just got drunk and talked to whoever was near me instead. After a while of this, I ran into a guy I worked with at one concert. I was already pretty drunk at this point, so I ended up telling him that I liked this girl, but I was too afraid to talk to her. Her response was to drag my drunken self up to her and strike up a conversation. When I'm drunk, I am actually pretty outgoing, so surprisingly things went well and I left very excited about everything. I sent her a message on Facebook a couple of days later and she remembered me, which was really encouraging, and I ended up asking her if she'd like to hang out sometime. She agreed and I nearly broke my desk, I was so excited. Since she worked nights on the radio as well as a second job, apparently 4 hours a night on a small radio station doesn't pay the bills, I ended up meeting her for lunch at the mall on her break. Lunch didn't go so well. My sober self clearly isn't as charming as my drunken self, and things were rather quiet and awkward. In desperation, I started talking about all the things we had in common, and eventually I got really desperate and told her I thought I might be falling for her. In hindsight, probably not the best thing to say to a girl who just met you, and she was understandably creeped out. She politely excused herself to go back to work, and I sat there and wanted to smash my head on the table. I knew I had blown my chances with her. Instead of admitting defeat, though, I just had to keep trying. I messaged her on Facebook about 1,000 times over the next couple of weeks, apologizing for coming on too strong and trying to get another shot. She responded a few times and was polite, but a lot less friendly than before. Eventually, she blocked me, and looking back, I can't say I blame her. At the time, though, I was distraught. Then my sadness turned to anger. At first, I was angry at myself more than anything, but then I started thinking things like, I was never really anything but nice to her. Why can't she just get to know me? I decided I needed to talk to her in person again, but she clearly was not going to meet at this point. So I would hang around her store in the mall, but I always seemed to miss her. After thinking about it today, I suspect they probably sent her to the back to hide when they saw me coming, but at the time I just thought she must work a different schedule every day. Finally, I waited for her after work at the radio station. This was my worst idea yet. As I mentioned, she was on the air at night, so it was after midnight when she came outside and got into her car to go home. I followed her. Even at the time I realized I was being creepy, but I was so desperate to be with this girl that I didn't care. I mean, this sort of thing happens all the time in the movies, and the girls eventually end up with a guy and they have this crazy romantic story to tell, right? Real life is not like the movies. She apparently called the cops on the way back to her place because they pulled in right behind us and dragged me out of the car. I was arrested and ended up on probation with a restraining order. I never had any intentions of hurting her, but I understand she had no way of knowing that at the time. Other than a handwritten apology letter which was read and delivered to her by a police officer, I had no further contact with her. She left the radio station and moved to another city shortly after. I've been through court-ordered therapy and some of my issues have gotten better. I actually have a girlfriend now and a pretty healthy relationship. Although I still suffer from anxiety and depression, I'm managing it and living a reasonably happy life now. I haven't creeped on anyone since. I was at my cousin's church. I was helping with the vacation Bible school at the time. I played Abednego, Cooper played Sadrach, and Tim played Meshach, 3 prominent biblical figures. While helping with VBS, I met an acquaintance of my cousin's, Matthew Wilson. Matthew was a socially awkward guy that had just recently moved to their church. He seemed like a nice guy but lacked humor, social skills, and confidence. Matthew was obsessed with Michael Jackson. He would constantly try to mimic Michael Jackson's dance moves. While they were impressively on point, it still made everyone shudder with cringe. He would try so hard to be funny and cool, but he would fail miserably every time. He was one of the most cringeworthy people I know in person. After spending time around Matthew, I found that something was a bit off with him. One day I told Emily that I thought Matthew was kind of weird, and she responded with, "You know what's wrong with him, right?" Then she told me that he told her that he was physically abused and his parents hated him. I had heard his story from Eric, Emily, and Eric told two very different stories. The story that Eric told me was that Matthew's parents formerly had a mild drinking problem but were fine now. The story that Emily told me was that they were critically addicted to alcohol and was extremely abusive to Matthew. I didn't believe the story he told Emily because Matthew is a notorious liar who exaggerates almost everything he says, and his parents were some of the most affectionate people. The next thing that Emily told me was the most shocking. Matthew was supposedly possessed by a demon. She told me that he has episodes in which he starts to convulse and his eyes turn pitch black. I didn't believe that. I told her that sounds like a serious medical condition, but she was adamant that it was a demon. She said that he would develop a sickening smile every time it happened and that she had witnessed it happen several times. Matthew lied all the time. I thought he probably faked it and she was just imagining the black eye part, or he had something severely wrong with him. Nothing really creepy popped up for a while until about 3 weeks ago. Several people were staying over at my cousin's house. Me, Matthew, Nathan, Matthew's slow-witted brother who takes everything literally, and Cameron, a good friend of Tim. Matthew was quite social, actually. He was playing Super Smash Brothers and cracking jokes. However, all of a sudden he stopped talking and playing the game. He abruptly stopped playing in the middle of a match and walked off blankly. He wasn't going to the bathroom or to go get something either. He would just wander off no matter what he was doing beforehand. It was totally random. It didn't explain why he quit in the middle of the game and didn't respond to any of our questions. He would have random spells of being blank and creepy. One minute he would be social and then the next he would go emotionless and unresponsive. Later I woke up at like 5 in the morning and saw Matthew sitting up and staring blankly at the wall. Everyone else was asleep. He didn't have his headphones nor his phone, he was just staring at the wall creepily. The next day, he was as social as can be and didn't have any unresponsive spells to my knowledge at the time. However, $50 of Eric's money disappeared. The blame shifted on Cameron, but I believe Matthew took the money. He was awake when everyone was asleep and is a known chronic liar. Emily later told me that Matthew came into her room very early, around 6:30, only about 30 minutes since she woke up. She told me that he came in there seeking refuge from the crowded, hot, and smelly room. Me, Tim, and Eric and Cameron were still sleeping in the room right next to hers. We had stayed up super late. Matthew plopped himself down in Emily's swing without his phone or anything to entertain himself and stared at Emily from the corner of his eye. Emily, a little creeped out, went to go let her dog in and wipe the mud off of their feet. When she was going back up the stairs to return to her room, she saw a tip of a shoe at the top of the stairway, mostly hidden by the dark corner. When she got to the top, she saw Matthew, sitting in the dark hallway, slowly banging his head on the wall. As soon as she walked into her room, he followed her in the room, saying a faint, emotionless whisper, "I'm not trying to scare you or anything." She then lied to him to get him to leave, saying she is about to change. About 1 week ago, Lena, Emily's best friend, revealed something very dark about Matthew. Matthew texted her quite a bit, bestowing his darkest secrets to her. He had fallen in love with her, which he freely told her. She was only 12 and he was 15. He told her that he hears voices, and every time he talks bad about himself, it isn't him, it was the demon. He told Lena that the demon specifically doesn't like her because she is nice to Matthew. I told Lena to tell him to stop and to block him. She refused to because she felt bad for him. That very night, Lena sent me some screenshots of messages that Matthew had sent her minutes prior. He texted her as the demon and acted like he was possessed. I had enough at this point. I told him off through a text. Cooper called my aunt, who then told Matthew's parents. The next day at church, Matthew and Nathan showed up at a much later time than usual. When he saw Lena, he went up and gave her a very uncomfortable and strange hug in which he leaned his head against hers and apologized. He exclaimed that it wasn't his fault, he couldn't control it. After the sermon, I was talking to Tyler, a good friend, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw Matthew staring dead at me. I turned around to see Matthew standing in the dark corner of the church, giving me a cold, unflinching stare. Today, Actually, only just a few minutes ago while writing this, he texted me, Tim, and Eric. He said, and I quote, "I'm going to take some time away for a while. I don't know how long, but it'll be several weeks. If you see me at church, don't talk to me. Don't ask why. Just know it's for the better." I have theorized to my cousins that he might have a multiple personality disorder. Some cases of this have people switching eye color when switching personalities, which explains the color changes during his episodes. While not black, several other kids who have also witnessed Matthew's episodes said his eyes do change when he enters these fits. The popular opinion is that they change to a very dark brown, while Matthew normally has very light blue eyes. Also, multiple different personalities can form when someone has had a very traumatic event. I believe whatever happened to Matthew's past created the demon. He didn't get enough attention as a kid, so he subconsciously created the demon to get attention. Or he could have schizophrenia. Matthew stated that he hears voices sometimes, or the most possible answer, this is a sick way to get attention and have been pretending this whole time. So if you're reading this, Matthew, I want you to know you are a pathetic human being that uses superstitions to mask your own problems and insecurities. Even though it's inevitable that I will see you again, I want you to leave and take your demon with you. I found some cheap train tickets to Luxembourg, and being the adventurous person I am, decided last minute to book them and go all by myself. Due to some unfortunate, lack of planning on my part, circumstances, I ended up on the train to Luxembourg with nothing to wear for the weekend except the clothes on my back. I figured it was no big deal. How boring would it be to have everything go according to plan for once? Luxembourg City is quite small, and after 2 days, I had pretty much seen most of what I wanted to see. A quick Google search showed me that there was a beautiful forest some kilometers north of the city. I thought it looked perfect, so I bought a day train pass and set out on my journey. I managed to make it there, and it was gorgeous. I wasn't really dressed for hiking since I had no clothes or shoes with me at the time, and didn't want to miss out on such an amazing experience, so I ventured into the forest anyways. I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt and ballet flats for shoes. I told myself I'd stay close to the area where the buses and cars park and not do any crazy rock climbing or anything, and nothing would go wrong. Boy, was that a dumb assumption to make. I was about 45 minutes away from where I started walking. There was no one else around. I walk along a sharp turn and there's a lady walking towards me. She was probably 45 or so. It seemed quite plain. As we approach each other, she suddenly says, "That's not okay." I ignored this, as I tried to ignore people on the street as much as possible and keep walking. She has reached the point of being right next to me now, and as she passes, she says, "You can't do this." There is no one else around, so she has to be talking to me. I reluctantly turn towards her and ask, "Pardon me?" She says, "How dare you show up here like this?" I'm thinking she has me confused for someone else, and I try to tell her she's got the wrong person and slowly keep walking. She turns towards me and says, "This forest is sacred. You can't come in here wearing shoes like that." At this point, I'm stopped, staring at this woman, confused. I offer an apology and keep going, but she follows me. She says, "You don't understand. You're ruining it." I say nothing. What am I supposed to say? I see some big branches close by. I could maybe use as weapons if I have to. I don't even know what's going on at this point. She's screaming now, repeating it's sacred and my shoes are ruining the sacredness of the forest. I stand my ground, offer one more apology. She tells me I'm going to regret it. I don't know why, but I told her that I had nothing else to wear, trying to justify myself, I guess. Then she tells me it doesn't matter. I'm starting to feel relieved. Maybe she'll leave me alone now. She says, "The forest is protected. Do you know who protects it?" I respond, no. Realistically, where can I run? Nowhere. Who can I call? No one. So I have to face this lady at all times. Don't want her attacking me from behind or something. She proceeds to tell me that Jesus Christ is protecting the forest. I nod. Sounds about right. She repeats that it doesn't matter to her anymore that I am wearing ballet flats. She then says that Jesus and God know since she told them. She tells me that God will not let me leave the forest. I say something along the lines of, "Pardon?" And she tells me slowly that God knows I have forsaken this forest and I am a traitor and a sinner. She tells me that I am not going to make it out of this forest. "You will never leave. God will not let you. He sees you here, ruining the sacredness of the forest. He sent me to find you. You had your chance. He will give you the punishment you deserve." I nod. I'm kind of scared, but at least she left it up to God to punish me, so I should be safe. I just need her to walk away. We hold eye contact for maybe 45 seconds, and then she turns and continues on. I stay where I am, slowly back up into a tree and wait while I watch her leave. I was afraid she had some nearby friends, so I wanted my back up to something. Made me feel safer. She was still within earshot, and she said, "He won't let you leave, you know. Nothing you can do will change that." She kept walking and never turned back. I waited 15 minutes with my back to that tree, then slowly kept going. I never saw her again. There was a period in time where I had to live with 3 roommates in an apartment. This apartment was a community with tons of buildings and a pool for everyone to use. It was very nice from the outside, but the landlords and services were terrible, like refusing to fix our air conditioning in the middle of summer. But that's another story. About a week or so after we moved in October of 2016, my roommates Jeff, Kylie, and Kristen and I returned from the store after light grocery shopping. We met a strange individual, an older man in his 40s, wearing sweatpants all the way up to his chest. He obviously was mentally challenged, so we were nothing but nice to him, greeted him, and stated our names. After all of us but Kylie returned to the apartment to put groceries away, she decides to invite him inside for some soda and chat. I've always been socially awkward and a bit of an introvert, so I avoided talking to new people and did my own thing. A couple of days pass and we get a knock on the door. It's the man again. We didn't mind it too much. It was in the middle of the day and we were for the most part home, so Kylie lets him in and they do some art together. But it began to get more and more habitual. When I was having a drink night with Kristen, we received a knock at the door at 7 or 8 p.m. We found this to be strange. Kristen opens the door and it's the man again, asking for Kylie. I made it very obvious that I didn't want him in, but she said, "Oh, she's out, but she should be home in a little while, I think." The man replies, "Can I have a soda?" Kristen agreed and he proceeded to let himself in without her inviting him, and he sat down by me. It was a truly awkward experience considering the two of us rarely spoke to him. Thankfully, Kylie came home shortly after so I could ditch the room and let her talk to him. I know I probably sound like an awful human, but I have extreme anxiety in these scenarios. Things began to get worse. Kylie was fed up with him coming over every day, and we decided to try to avoid him for a bit. Every now and then we would hear scratching at the door. We simply turned off the lights and stayed quiet until it stopped. I think at one point Kylie tried talking to him about not being comfortable with him coming over so often, but I can't confirm that. It started to escalate a bit more when we came home one day and found a bunch of drawings taped to our door. We brought them inside and looked at them. I wish I still had the pictures of them, but it was so long ago. They were sketches of each of us and Kristen's cat. They were distorted in a strange way, like his perception was obscure or just a really bad artist. This sparked a series of basically every night we had to sit in the dark while he scratched our door and knocked. We would keep weapons nearby just because you never know what someone is capable of. The door was always locked, but I don't recall him ever trying anything more than just the scratching. We decided to take some action and talk to the landlord's office about it. They said they couldn't do anything and we would have to call the police. We didn't want to call the police because we were certain this man had some sort of disability, so We did the only thing we could think of. We ghosted him. The next thing we found on our door was a sign language booklet. It was filled with scratchy notes written in pen, words crossed out and written over, multiple languages and poems. We kept the evidence in a cabinet just in case we decided to later report it. Some months went by over the course of this happening. It was the midst of winter and we received our final gift from our strange friend, a letter. I can't recount exactly what it said, but it was something along the lines of, "Why have you all stopped talking to me? Do you not want to be friends anymore? I'm very angry with you." But sprawled out over 2 paragraphs. I remember we felt a level of fear and discomfort with this letter, so we continued to ghost until we eventually stopped. I ended up moving out before the next autumn. My roommates were a little too party animal for me, but I hope to this strange man that we don't meet again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. All the links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.